So in this video, we're going to be talking about memory, and this is a very, very simple overview just to give you the basic facts about what we know about the more explicit memories, which is the ones that we are, I suppose, consciously aware of, as opposed to implicit memories, which is more to do with sort of autopilot things like learning to ride a bike, and once you've learned it, it's very difficult to forget it, and so on. So really we're talking about explicit memories here, and how the process of memorizing something and bringing it back to mind works. So the first thing to say, of course, is that the memory must be formed on the basis of something that we perceive, so some kind of environmental stimulus. So this might be something that we see or we hear or even smell. And there is this very brief transitory process of sensory memory where we just immediately become aware of whatever it is that we're perceiving at that moment, but that's really milliseconds. From that point, for us to recognize that it's something worth remembering, we have to pay attention. So attending to something literally means to focus on it in some form, and that's a necessary part of memory formation. And it's an important point to make, because some people actually, they don't really have an intrinsic issue with memorizing things. It's that they're not paying attention in the first place. It's not going in. So not paying attention to what's going on around you, of course, means that you won't remember whatever it is that you're experiencing that time. Now, attention can be reduced for many, many reasons, but it seems that the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, is most likely to be the part of the brain that's involved in that process. So you must attend to whatever it is you've seen or heard. Then it becomes what we call a short-term memory or working memory. Now these are used synonymously, although they're slightly different. Working memory is more about manipulating the information so that you can use it. Short-term memory is, I suppose, just sort of registering it in the first place, but they often are used interchangeably. So whilst the memory is a short-term memory, it tends to again be in that sort of front part of the brain while you're sort of consciously aware of it. Now, if you don't become, or you lose conscious awareness of it, it then tends to go after a while. So of course this happens thousands of times during the day, that we might for a period of time sort of pay attention to something, then it goes and we sort of forget that we've done it. So generally speaking, short-term memory in this context lasts less than a minute or so, and when we focus on something else, it tends to go. Now, if we are wanting to, or perhaps even sometimes not wanting to, retain that memory, then it has to go through another process, and it essentially moves on from the frontal lobe through a tiny little structure, which is actually really a critical structure called the hippocampus. Now, in Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common cause of dementia, it is the hippocampus mostly, in the sort of classic late onset Alzheimer's disease, that tends to be one of the first structures that we know is affected. And so it shrinks, it loses volume, and it becomes less effective, which then leads to this inability to acquire new memories. So you might be able to notice things in your immediate environment, you might even be able to remember them for that short period of time that you're actually talking about them, but once they're left and you've lost consciousness of them, you have not in any way acquired or encoded them, because the hippocampus is faulty. So encoding is really kind of a process of pulling together the different threads of a memory. So everything that we perceive ordinarily has different perhaps senses to it. So there might be some emotional component, there might be something that we see, there might be something that we hear, and the hippocampus seems to be really important at bringing together the different threads of the memory and then packaging it up or encoding it. And so once the memory is encoded, it's then sent to the cortex, which is the sort of outer layer of the brain, where it resides as what we call long-term memory. Now, one of the things about long-term memory is actually it probably isn't stored in one particular place. And again, when we're trying to pull back that memory at some point, the brain has to go through this process of actively pulling together those different threads of the memory again to bring it out again. But essentially long-term memories sort of reside in the cortex somewhere. And in order to then bring that memory to mind, so somebody was to ask you, where were you on such and such a day or whatever, and that's a long-term memory. You actually have to kind of consciously think about it and pull it back. And that process is known as retrieval. And so you're retrieving the memory, and it's the front part of the brain again that's responsible for that. And so we often see people who don't have anything like Alzheimer's disease or dementia, the memory is in there, the information's there, particularly as you get older, it can be harder to pull it out again. But you can be given a sort of clue as to what it is that you've forgotten, cueing as we describe it, and then that helps in that retrieval process. It sort of seems to pull the other bits together, and then you can remember what it is you've forgotten. So retrieval is the process of bringing back the memory from the cortex into conscious awareness so you can think about it. So just to recap, you need to attend to whatever it is going on in the environment. That's the front part of the brain. It then enters the sort of front part where it becomes short-term memory or possibly working memory, which is fairly short-lived and disappears when you've lost conscious awareness of it. For it to become a long-term memory, it then needs to be encoded and processed through the hippocampus, pulling the different parts of the memory together, and then it's sent, in a sense, to the cortex where it becomes a long-term memory. And then to bring the information back to mind, you have to retrieve it, which is a frontal lobe function again. So there you go. That's a very simple overview of explicit memory, and hope that's been helpful.